Okay, I do have to, before I get started, give a nod to, if you guys have done any research on the internet, this world of the internet, I'm going to give a little nod to the website, the Viking Answer Lady, which is, she is a Scadian. She is from Anstiora, Gnor, Safrar, I think is how her name is pronounced. What a great resource. I did use her as a source, as a reference, and I will be uploading my my handouts and a reference sheet to the Mid-Realm drive later. I was still tweaking my PowerPoints during the keynote session this morning. Here is my email, though, if you want to reach out to me. I love to hear from people. So I am Isobella Gray. I am in the of Donnershafen. I live in the barony of Donnershafen. Not to be mistaken, there is another Isobella Gray, and she does live in our in Mid-Realm. So make sure you find me, not her. She might go, what? What are you talking about? So I'm going to start off and say, if you haven't done any research on Vikings, a lot of what we know about the Vikings or the Norsemen or the Norse, whatever term you want to use, comes from the sagas that were left behind. And these were written by Christians up to centuries after this community. So we want to, when we're approaching this this population, this topic, look at it through this lens. So I had, when I was researching this and started learning, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Oh, this is interesting. Before I delve in a little bit more, I want to give a little ears warning. I do have some adult kind of topics in here. I will be talking a little bit about sex and sex topics, briefly talking about domestic violence and sexual slavery as it pertains to this culture. So just a heads up. I don't want to catch anybody off guard. I have to put this slide in here because of my mundane job. I am a nurse in my mundane profession. So I just have to tell you guys, I'm not getting any reimbursement from anybody outside of the SEA. This is all voluntary. That way, if somebody comes back, I can't get my hand slapped. Okay, so brief overview for those of you who may or may not know this. So Vikings come from a time history, what the defined Viking period is 793 to 1066 AD. And these are set by researchers, modern day researchers, with two kind of significant events. The first is a specific raid on English soil. The last is a specific battle. We find Vikings kind of spread out over Ireland, Scotland, the Orkney Islands, Shetland Islands, parts of England, northern France, which is where we call present-day Normandy, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, Greenland, Russia. We've also found other parts of the world where the Vikings have traveled to where they were not so successful. Viking is a modern word for multiple groups that fit in this culture. Generally, Viking is a seafaring person. They were farmers. Other words you might hear are Northmen, Norsemen, or the Norse. So as I go into my presentation, we're going to talk about social class a lot. So there's three social classes in our culture here. The Jarls, which is our aristocracy, our Carls, which is our, the reference I refer to called it the lower class, but it's kind of like the middle class. And then the thralls, which is our slaves. So this map just shows where Viking exploration went, and where settlements were. The darker red, they are the more concentrated, the earlier into the period. Just to give you guys an idea. So when we talk about travel as well. All right, so let's talk about how did we choose a spouse? Vikings married, usually marriageable age was between the age of 12 to 15, which seems to be about pretty constant, especially when we look at other medieval cultures, especially at least for females. Women we started marrying them off, maybe not as early as 12, but we certainly started talking about marriage and we started betrothing them. Generally, our spouse is chosen by our family, and usually the male members of our family. And we did this to create alliances, generate support during conflict, and even sometimes for financial gain. Neither the man or the woman chose their spouse. Like I said, the men of the clan chose for them. Potential spouses were found at the thing. Sometimes we met spouses at markets, social events, and other places. So the thing was really the best place to find for a father to find a spouse for his unmarried daughter. He would bring his unmarried daughter to the thing. One, for his own comfort, she would cook and clean and do those domestic things for him. But that was also a way for him to show his unmarried daughter off to the other men, to be who maybe had unmarried sons, and be like, oh yeah, check out my daughter, look how good look what a good job she does, and what a great spouse she would make your son. Now, I found it interesting. In some places it said widows could choose their own spouses, but in other places I found that we'll talk about guardians, that a son or a son-in-law could actually be a guardian. So we have some conflicting interests for information. So speaking of, our Fastnandi, if I'm pronouncing this right, is our guardian to our maiden or our woman. So usually as our father. If the father was not alive, it could be another male relative, an uncle, an older brother. It could even be a woman's son if he was over 16. To be a guardian, or it could be a son-in-law as well. Again, if he obviously would have to be over 16. Brothers could be guardians if they were not maliciously blocking marriages. Occasionally we would find that the marriages would be maliciously blocked by brothers who would try to keep that woman on the family farm as farm laborers. So if this was happening, then the law would allow the woman to marry the third person or the third suitor that the brothers refused. So they couldn't keep, so the woman could have some control.
Sorry to interrupt. In the chat, someone said, am I wrong? I was under the impression from the sagas that women had a lot of input on who they married and who they divorced, which seemed rare for the era.
So I will get to that. Women had some input, but the men in the family had the final decision. The women, a lot of times the fathers would ask the women or their daughters. However, they didn't have to. Remember this, the sagas approach this from a very Christian standpoint. So we have to go back to like Scandinavian laws and that, and rune writings, and look at those. And women did have their input, but ultimately it was the men in the family's final decision. And most of the time, if they knew what was best for them, when we talk about divorce, they 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 spoke to their daughter and they said, oh, this, I'm thinking about marrying you, I have this suitor in mind, um what do you think? They didn't just say, surprise, because marriages took a long time to get everything in a row or together, and we'll talk about that. So we see some different types of marriages in this culture. So I touched on, creating alliances. So one thing I found interesting is we don't see a lot of marriage by romance. They actually refer to romance as kind of a fool's game. Couples were expected to find that part of the marriage after they were married. So instead of falling in love first, like we do modernly, and then getting married, we were like, okay, well, we're going to get some approval, we're going to do some handshakes, and then now there you go. Marriage by capture, there's some, I just lost my word. Some thought with researchers that the some of the raids were done because there were more men than women, or there weren't enough marriageable women, so there was raids so that they could bring back women who they could marry by force. Marriage by purchase, we don't hear as much about, but they actually bought women from other cultures and then brought them back and forced them into a kind of a marriage. So kind of like an early mail order bride is kind of what comes to my mind when I think about that. So like I said, courtship didn't normally occur, not in the way we think about it. And courtship, love poems, all that, was considered inappropriate for a woman's reputation. While extramarital sex did occur before marriage, they did hold virginity important for reasons of legitimate children. If a woman was engaged in sexual relations before marriage, especially with another man, there could be question of the legitimacy of the children in the marriage. So then the man may not accept those children as his. Then the woman's family would be expected to raise them if he didn't accept those children as his own, and that would be a financial burden on them. If he did accept those children, then they had the right to inherit, although inheritance laws could differ depending on kind of which country that particular couple was from. They vary a little bit. So like I said, couples were kind of expected to figure it out. It's like, all right, they may have met before, they may know each other, but they didn't get a lot of interaction together until after the wedding. So it was like, all right, here's who we chose for you. Now you're married. Off you go. Any questions so far? Other questions, new questions? All right. Hansel is our formal agreement. So this is our contract. It was sealed with a hand clasp. So this is this I found interesting. So this is where we made the agreement. Our families have gotten together. The husband's been chosen. The or the groom, the bride's been chosen, the family's agreed on all the elements. They seal it with a hand clasp. When it was described in the writing, when they said hand clasp, at first I was thinking handshake, but to me, and it's kind of hard, I'm thinking it's more like this. That's how they sealed legal agreements. A couple of things that needed to happen. It needed to be witnessed by at least 6 men. A couple of things that needed to be agreed on was the brew cop, which is the bride price, and there's 3 or what we call nowadays the dowry. And there's 3 elements to this. The Munder and the Morning Gifu, the groom paid. The first one, the Munder, is what most modern references refer to as the actual bride price. It's paid to the father, and this is paying him, father, for, or the male guardian, for control of guardianship. The next one, the Morning Fu, was paid the morning after the first morning. And that was the groom's kind of payment to the wife if she was a virgin, for her virginity, or for being available to him in a wife's way, and for maintenance of the wife, for the marriage. That was her spending account, if it was finances, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The last one was the bride's family paid to the so there was money going both ways, and that's the Heman Phrygia, and that was paid to the groom's family. So for, thank you for giving your son to our family. So again, agreements that needed to be made is who's going to support whom with war. How are we going to do this? We'll talk a little bit more about hand fasting, but I believe, as I've read more, this is kind of where modern day hand fasting has come in. I'll talk about that. So preparation for the ceremony. Any questions on that? Contractual agreement. Okay. So the ceremony, if it's taken that long enough for the contract to be made, the ceremony could take place immediately. One source said it could take up to 3 years. So some things needed to be put in place. We had to take into consideration travel. Weather could significantly impact this part of the world, especially certain times of the year. The celebration and the ceremony, or the celebration, was a week long. And so careful planning had to take place for to have enough food. There had to be mead. The couple would drink mead for a month after their nuptial ceremony. Mead is a honey based, so we had to make sure there was enough. Is a honey based drink, if you don't know what mead is. So we had to make sure there's enough mead available for the couple. So consideration of the time of year for food and things like that, making sure that the honey was available, that the mead that was prepared was ready, that family and friends could travel, that people weren't off on raids that needed to be at the wedding. So then both the bride and the groom would go through separate preparations. So the bride would be prepared by her female family members. And this signified the bride's, so the day of the wedding ceremony, transition from an unmarried woman to a married woman. Um, she would, get up in the morning, she would meet with her married family members. Um, she would be wearing a crassin, which is a type of crown that unmarried young women would wear. Um, Generally, it was a family heirloom of some sort, and that would be packaged up and put away. And that would be kept for the bride's daughter, um, when it was her time to wear the crassin and then transition to her um, married life. Now, they didn't indicate in the sources, at what age did they start wearing this crassin, or did they just start wearing it while they were preparing for the wedding ceremony, or did they always wear it? So, hair was really important, I found out. So they, um, a lot of the cultures um, appreciated long hair and light colored hair. They looked at that as a thing of beauty. So the bride's hair would be left down and untied. So this would be the last time in public she would have her hair untied and left uncovered. Going forward, the following day, she would always have her hair covered in some sense. Um, so then she would enter the bathhouse with her female family members, and this was more like started out with a steam bath followed by a cold water dip. Now, not ice cold, but cold enough, it said, to close the pores. There would be herbs or oils added to scent the water, um, as well as there's some likely thought that this also added some magic, some aphrodisiac, helped with fertility and things like that, to help bless the couple for their marriage. Then the bride would have or she would dress for the ceremony. There's no special like bridal dress. She would just put on, her nicest dress. Maybe a new dress would be made, but it was, then something she would just include into her everyday clothes. And then she would be her family members would place on his bridal crown. And this is where some of the authors get, some kind of differences of opinion. Some people said, this is a natural crown, that things were added to it each. And some other authors said, no, this is a metal crown that was jeweled. And so different authors have some different opinions here. During this whole time, it's married women in the family, because during this whole time, they are giving the bride advice on how to be a wife, how to run a household, how to be a mother, and how to be successful at it. Because up until now, Viking women really weren't, this isn't part of their education. They're taught how to do other things, other women things. So with the grooms, they go through very similar preparation. They're accompanied by their male family members, getting kind of the same advice. They don't have the crown that we're talking about that the women does. They're also required to obtain the ancestral sword. Now, in the sagas, they talk about breaking open the grave of an ancestor and obtaining the sword from a deceased family member. Several authors I've read suspect that they probably didn't literally go dig up their dead ancestors' swords, but probably got it from a living family member, along with all the advice on how to be a good husband. They said, but it's not out of the question. So they would, and they would enter the bathhouse. Was their symbol of washing away their bachelorhood. They would do the steam bath and then the dip in the water. And they would be attended by their male family members. Also would dress in nice clothing, but again, there was no set groom clothing. Any questions yet? So far, so good. Okay. All right, so our officiant is called our Gothi, or plural or Gothar. This person could be male or female. So a couple places I read that only women were priestesses or did religious things. So I have some speculations personally here. I was like, wait, what? Could this be male or female? But this is the person who was the officiant. So I was a little bit, so take that with, however, to be researched more. So they don't talk a lot in the research about the person who oversaw the ceremony. And I'm thinking, wow, this is a really important person. We have to have this person here. Well, a couple of the things he did say is this could be a person that was hard to find because there was not a lot of them. So that might be an influencing factor. If they could be male or female in the time frame. So in the ceremony, we may have a goat that should say boar, not board. I will fix that before I upload it. This is what happens when you do things in the middle of the night. Or a horse. So there's a couple of things we could do with this animal. So the groom was responsible for obtaining the animal. So if the first thing the Gothi would do would call upon the gods to get their attention and bless this union. If we wanted Thor, we would get a goat. If we wanted Freya, we'd get a sow. If we wanted Freyr, we would get a horse. Now we could do a couple of things with this animal. We could sacrifice it and use the blood in the ceremony for blessings, or the TV show Vikings, where they're pouring the blood on Lagatha. That's from what I read, kind of accurate. And then they would sprinkle the guest with blood later in the ceremony. And then they would use the animal as part of the wedding feast. So if they decided we're not going to sacrifice the animal, they would still dedicate the animal to the appropriate god or goddess. That animal would live out its life as a sacred beast. So it was really well treasured. And it was revered. And it would be kept by the couple to bless their marriage. So the ceremony itself had to take place on Friday, which was Frigg or Frigga's day. Or more modernly called Freya. This is Odin's wife, and we use Friday because she's the goddess of love, sex, fertility, marriage, happy family. So we want to be blessed by her. And on the first full moon. Now I only saw one source that kind of talked about this, so I am approaching that one with a little bit of if he really didn't talk about why. So, and then so probably should have put that slide earlier. Anyways, sorry, that was random thought. So then we would have, after we bless the animal, call on our gods, we would have the exchange of the swords. So to the ceremony, the groom would have carried in his sword. The bride would have been led in by a younger family member, holding her sword for her. The groom presents his sword to his bride as a symbol of thank you for I trust you to carry on my family name and tradition. The bride presents her sword to him as I trust you to protect me and our children together. So it's very, very symbolic. As part of the exchange of the swords, finger rings were also included. So the finger rings, the bride's ring would be placed on the hilt of the groom's sword. The sources did not say if the groom's ring was on the hilt of the sword, although I kind of wonder and suspect maybe that was probably. Or I missed that part. They may also exchange armbands. So the armbands we see as part of that exchange in vows to strengthen that vow. And the ring has a very similar meaning to what we use modernly, with the ring has no beginning, no end. So this is my little aside on hand fasting. So it's really unclear from what I have read thus far if hand fasting really is a Viking tradition. I think that hand fasting really comes from that term for our joining hands for contract we saw earlier. We do know it was practiced on the Isle of Man in about 1600, but I really couldn't find in the references where this was part of our Viking marriage ceremonies. We do have words in Danish and Norwegian for hand fasting, but this meant to join the hand to strike a contract, which marriage would fall under. So I really, from reading and reading the sources, I really think this is what this falls under. Not what we think of the more modern and post-period joining the hands of the bride and groom and tying it with the hand fasting cord. If somebody has information otherwise, I would love to hear it. Feel free to email me and be like, no, you've got that completely wrong. I'm okay. So after the celebration, right? So there would be a race. The couple would race to the hall. And the losers would have to serve the winner. Usually the groom would be on his horse, so the bride and her family would usually there have to meet them there because the bride would be on foot. And this was kind of how it would prepare them for their lives together. So the losers would have to serve the winners all night their food, their wine. Once they arrived at the hall, the groom would strike the main timber with his sword. This is a sign of was a sign of protection and strength for his bride and for prosperity in the family, especially when the bride gives birth. And there was a term, and I did the thing that Mr. Serena said not to this morning, and I didn't write down the term for this actual thing. So when the bride actually gave birth, she would hold on to the timber to help protect her through the birthing process. So once that concluded, then the celebration would begin. So there would be feasting and drinking and merriment and dancing and music. So then at some point, the consummation of the union would happen. So there's, again, some debate. Did this happen earlier in the day or did this happen at night? Most scholars think this happened at night, as it traditionally does. So the bride would be taken to the sleeping chamber by her attendants. She would be prepared, and then the groom would follow. She would be put to bed, and then the groom would follow and be put to bed. Now, there's a couple of schools of thought here. What would truly happen? The groom would remove the bride's bridal crown. And there had to be at least 6 witnesses to witness the consummation of the marriage. Now, it's unclear at this point, would the witnesses leave after the bridal crown was removed because this was ceremonially the consummation of the marriage, or would the witnesses actually stay for the actual sex act? So if they were questioned later about the consummation of the marriage, because something came into question, legitimacy of the children, they could actually say, yeah, we were here, they did the thing. It's not really clear from that. So the second morning, the bride would get up early and leave. She would be prepared by her married family folk and then dressed for the first time as a married woman. So her hair would be done up differently. She would put on her married woman cap for the first time, which would be this huge honor. This would be the point where then she would return to the celebration and the morning food would be paid. This is the second part of the bride price that is paid to her by the groom. They, like I said earlier, thanking her for her virginity or thanking her for making her personal self available to the groom. Usually this included things like clothing, jewelry. It might have household goods, slaves, livestock, and if they were upper class, land and estates. So, and then the celebration would continue on. They would drink, eat, and then the couple would continue to drink mead for the 30 days. So again, contributing to where we get the honeymoon. So questions. I'm going to transition a little bit and talk about some different types of cultural differences. Okay, so far so good. One thing we do see here, and I'm sorry if I mess up this word, I've been practicing, we see some polygyny here. So this is where a man has multiple wives. And evidence shows this, especially in the higher ranking men. So we scholars question, because of this, did this decrease the number of eligible women? So adding to the reason we needed, they needed to have raids, so that that lower class had to raid more to bring back women that they were able to marry? Or was it that the upper class men raided so they could have more wives or bring back slaves? One thing we do know is that concubinage, or the keeping of a concubine, was common in the upper class or the social elites. So concubines were generally poor women of lower social class, but these were not this is not a form of marriage, but I want to mention this here because we do see this mentioned a lot, or I did see this mentioned a lot when I was looking at my research. A married man may have a wife or several wives, or one wife and a concubine or several concubines. They may have children with the concubine. They refer to these as frillies or frills. I'm not quite sure how they. Um, and they may all live under the same roof. The wife, the husband, his wife or wives, and his concubine or concubines, and all the children. And they would raise all the women would raise all the children together. One of the things that these relationships did for a male, especially our upper class males, our social elites, is it increased the chances of having multiple male children. And in this kind of culture where they were going out to war, we had a lot of deaths, high infant mortality. We needed those numbers. So another thing that I found was that there was definitely a pecking order. So usually the first wife, if there was multiple wives, was the head wife. Or if there was a wife and concubines or sex slaves, which I'll talk about next, there was a pecking order. So the head wife was in charge. So sex slaves were kept. They were sometimes referred to as bed slaves, usually kept by the most powerful men of the tribe or the group, like the chieftain. At his death, the man's death, the slaves were sacrificed. And as a sign of the tribe's love for their leader, and then the slave would be cremated with her master so that she could continue to serve him in the next life. So, and a lot of these sex slaves were brought back from, so these were women that a lot of times were brought back from raids. So we kind of led to this, or kind of alluded to this earlier. So women did have more rights than a lot of, excuse me, women in this time frame. They were allowed to divorce, and there were a lot of reasons why. And I'm going to next touch on that the next slide. They could become priestesses. They could run businesses. They could fight in battles, but women were expected to remain faithful. If a woman was caught straying outside the marriage, he could cut off her hair. Like I said earlier, long hair was considered a sign of beauty. And he could sell his wife as a sex slave if she was caught being unfaithful, especially if she got pregnant. If she avoided pregnancy, a lot of times she could avoid the harsh penalties. If a man was caught with another man's wife, he could be castrated, and they would hang the products of a woman could, if she caught a woman could, a lot of times they would hang the products of castration on his front door. So divorce, yes, women were allowed to divorce for a lot of reasons. So if a husband, they believed in sexual satisfaction for both men and women. So if the husband wasn't sexually satisfying his wife, she could divorce him. If he didn't have sex with her for 3 years, she could divorce him. If he slapped her 3 times, she could divorce him. If her husband was homosexual, turned out to be homosexual, or a cross-dresser, or if the wife turned out to be a cross-dresser, they could divorce. To divorce, it had to be announced 3 times. The first time, it had to be announced in the bedroom. The second time in front of the home, and then the third time in the public hall. and there had to be 6 witnesses every time. And they had to, there was a certain way they had to say it. They could address their spouse, I divorce you, and this is why. On divorce, the bride could reclaim her dowry or her bride price. Vikings were not allowed to beat their wives. It was frowned upon and publicly shamed. Another reason women could divorce their husbands in this culture. If this happened 3 times, women could castrate their husbands and hang the products of castration on their front door as well, as a warning sign or a message, kind of don't mess with this woman, I guess.
Sorry, real quick in the chat, there's a post here that if he couldn't satisfy her sexually, she could request divorce. There is a saga about the guy being cursed with a large member by a witch, and then the wife goes to her father for a divorce.
That's awesome.
And
it's kind of awesome and sad all at the same time.
And then also, just to let you know, about 7 minutes.
Yep, I saw it. I'm watching. So a couple more, children. And so I'm gonna touch on children real briefly. So I've already talked about this. Children born in and out of the marriage could inherit. This is why we have concubines and sex slaves. The children who are legitimate inherited more than the ones who were born from these other marriages. Women generally raised the children, but as they got older, they would focus more on the female children and teach them female things. Not saying that the girls didn't learn both, like fighting and stuff, and the men would focus more on teaching the boys the boy things they needed to learn. And then the last thing I just wanted to touch on was the influence of Christianity. Conversion to Christianity was the single most biggest impact on marriage and the Viking culture. Women had to consent. That was probably the biggest impact. So to get around this, fathers started betrothing their daughters before they understood. And this didn't stop families from coming up with other creative ways too. But this didn't stop women from coming up with creative ways to get out of bad marriages or to get out of marriages entirely. This also saw a huge increase in Scandinavian religious houses, because women could take their part of their inheritance and go into a religious house and say, well, I'm not going to, I don't want to marry this guy that my parents want me to marry. And, the Christian church, the Catholic church, they're not going to frown on a woman taking holy orders. With the integration of the Christian church, women marriages had to be officiated under the church. And then the polygyny, and concubinage and sexual slaves was really abandoned, and monogamy was explicitly supported and really pressed by the Christian church, even though we know it still continued to persist in some ways. So I have my references, which will be on there, and I have also put them in a separate document that I'll upload for you guys. Any questions, last minute questions? We have a couple minutes. I want to thank everybody for coming. This is literally my second rum class, and thank you, Lynn, for being my sidekick.
No problem. It was fun. Thank you for teaching.
Yeah, thank you.
It's really cool. And I have 2 books I'll show you guys. So a couple of books, if you guys want to know more. The Real Valkyrie. Somebody was talking about this earlier in the social room. Awesome book. And then another one I got, especially if you're interested in women in the Viking era, women in Old Norse society. And these are both in my list. So really wonderful books. And then general history, the Vikings. This one's by Robert Ferguson.
Thank you.